So finally, this is your latest summary of everything you've learned in the last 5 years that's triggered the low carb ketoverse. Please explain your view on the carb insulin hypothesis and yeah.
And I love all these carb insulin hypothesis people. I love Taubes. I love Dr. Ludwig. I love Dr. Lustig. I love all the carb insulin people. And I used to believe in it completely myself. The problem is there's just way too many black swans, right? The standard carb insulin model was that eating carbs raises insulin, and that puts your body into storage mode. And like the really dumb version that I've labeled ridiculous here is that just eating carbs and having high insulin just makes you fat. Now that is completely impossible because you can, when you store fat, it's a mechanical process. You have to actually have the carbon atoms in fat to store fat. You can't just create fat out of thin air, right? Like you have to literally count every single carbon atom that's involved with fat. Every time you eat fat, all of those carbon atoms are literally going to end up being stored as fat, except for maybe a few that you don't absorb and they travel through your digestive tract, or maybe a few that are burned while they're in your circulation on their way to your fat cells. But statistically speaking, all the fat you eat gets stored in your fat cells, and you can literally count every carbon atom that you've eaten and then every carbon atom that appears in your adipocytes. And fat will only leave your body when it's oxidized in your mitochondria and you exhale it as carbon dioxide. And again, you can just count the carbons. I'm eating the carbons from fat. The carbons are being stored in my fat cells. The carbons are being, the fat is being oxidized in my mitochondria. And one by one, you can count all those carbon atoms being exhaled in your breath. And so like literally you can't create fat out of nothing. It's just straight up thermodynamics. So you cannot become fat just because your insulin's high. I could inject you with 100 gallons of insulin every minute of every day forever, and you won't create any fat. You won't generate any fat. You won't get any fatter. It's physically impossible. That's why I labeled that as ridiculous. Now, I think another way of looking at it.
Just to interject there, well, like people say I can make you fat by injecting you with insulin. And yeah, you can make somebody fat by injecting insulin, because if I grabbed my wife's insulin needle and ran around and jamming you with insulin all day, your blood sugar would drop because your lipolysis would stall. You get really hungry, reach for the jar of peanut butter and donuts and eat a whole lot more. And because the exogenous insulin is shutting off your release of stored energy, you're going to get really hungry. But your own pancreas doesn't create more insulin than it absolutely needs to hold back the floodgates of your stored energy while you're still eating. So understanding exogenous versus endogenous insulin is just critical to this carb insulin hypothesis and understanding the true solution.
Right. And actually, that's why the second one that I've labeled just incorrect, there is a grain of truth there. So like, in that model, you eat carbs, you raise insulin, that makes you hungrier, and then you eat more food and you get fatter. That one actually respects the laws of thermodynamics. That could actually happen. And in fact, there are extremely rare people with insulinomas, which is a pancreatic tumor that produces insulin, and about 30 or 40% of them will be fatter when they're diagnosed than the average person. In fact, I think they usually gain anywhere from 5 to 15 extra kilograms between when they're diagnosed and when they have their surgery. In like 2 or 3 years, your average insulinoma person's going to gain 5, 10, 15 kilos because they are producing more insulin and they are hungrier and they are eating more. And so there is something to that. But what you're pointing out is the fact that your body's not going to produce more insulin than it needs to just hold your energy into its storage. And that's why I think looking at basal insulin is far more important than the spikes of insulin from eating. So this basal insulin is never going to be artificially high just because you ate carbs. And that's why in pretty much any study that matches protein and calories, you can isocalorically replace carbs with fat or fat with carbs, and you will get the exact same outcome. And I think that really does falsify this basic model. Although there is a grain of truth there. Like you said, if you chase me around with your wife's insulin pen, I would be hungry, I would gain weight. Or if I had an insulinoma, I would gain weight. So there is something to that. And I see that and I admit it. But I don't think that explains your average garden variety obesity. And in fact, if you isocalorically replace all your carbs with fat or fat with carbs, you don't see any differences.
Yeah. Cool. That's awesome. We had a bunch of rapid